Should the death penalty be abolished worldwide? The US allows for more methods for executing inmates, as nearly 40 countries reject the latest UN resolution against the practice. So why is capital punishment still favoured in many places? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The death penalty is undoubtedly one of the most controversial issues around the world. And although it's been abolished in much of the world, it's still carried out in at least 54 countries, including China and the United States. For decades, the US has used lethal injections to execute those convicted of certain crimes. But the Justice Department has now allowed more methods, including firing squad and electrocution. The US Constitution, however, strictly bans what it describes as cruel and unusual punishment. Rights groups accuse the Trump administration of rushing to execute 5 inmates before the president's term ends in January. Last week, the US was one of 39 countries that rejected a UN resolution for a moratorium on capital punishment. But with 120 votes in favour, the General Assembly is expected to adopt the measure next month. The UN Secretary General has said the death penalty has no place in the 21st century. Now, Amnesty International says more than 26,600 people are known to be on death row around the world. It recorded at least 657 executions in 20 countries last year. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq and Egypt accounted for more than 86% of all capital punishment last year. The US is ranked 6th of the total number of executions with 22. But rights groups say that China is the world's biggest executioner, with thousands believed to be killed every year. Beijing doesn't release death penalty figures. Let's welcome our panel of guests, all joining us on Skype. In Melbourne, Stephanie McLennan, a senior manager at Asia Initiatives for Human Rights Watch. In Tehran, Hamid Mousavi, Professor of Political Science at Tehran University, and in Portrush, Northern Ireland, Ian Woods, author of Surviving Execution, A Miscarriage of Justice and the Fight to End the Death Penalty. A welcome to you all. I'd like to begin in Tehran with Hamid Mousavi. You actually support the death penalty. Why do you think it makes such a deterrent?
Well, I think the first issue here is we have to look at every country separately. I don't think we can have a general rule for the entire globe regarding capital punishment. The latest data on Iran, the World Value Survey, which was actually conducted in 2020, so it's very recent, asked the Iranians what they thought of capital punishment. It was on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being never suitable and 10 being always suitable. Over 80% of Iranians actually chose a number of 5 or over. So a majority of Iranians, including myself, support the capital punishment system. And I think it does act as a deterrent for potential violent crime perpetrators. And I don't think just because you have certain laws in other countries, they have to be enforced in countries such as Iran.
Well, I mean, just because something's popular doesn't mean it's right. It's still the death penalty. That mistakes can be made and people can be executed in error. And that's pretty final. I mean, how can you justify something that isn't 100% effective?
True, there can be errors, of course. And I mean, I'm not supporting any errors or actual innocent people getting killed. But at the same time, I think violent perpetrators of crimes, such as serial killers, I think they have let go their right of life by killing other innocent people. And I think the families of these victims, they deserve justice. So we have to also look at this from the angle of people who are victims as well as their families.
Stephanie McLennan, what do you think? Our guest in Tehran says it's an effective deterrent, but it's also something that should be up to the individual country.
Look, I strongly disagree with that assertion. There's been repeated comments by the UN and the Special Rapporteur that the death penalty serves no deterrent purpose. There's been no evidence to that effect whatsoever by any credible, independent, reputable source. It's a barbaric form of punishment, and it serves absolutely no purpose in any society. We are talking about fundamental human rights here, and regardless of what somebody has done or has been perceived to have done, they should never be sentenced to death. And I oppose that view in its entirety.
But it is an effective deterrent, according to many of the regimes that carry it out. It keeps their societies in check as the ultimate punishment. Is there no sympathy with that argument?
Look, it's an emotional topic. I understand that people want a really simple, finite solution to an issue such as a graphic crime. People just think will take away their life, but it's not as simple as that. We know that in many countries that support the death penalty, there's massive issues in terms of fair trial, due process, rule of law, independent judiciaries. So I think it's a much more nuanced and complex issue than this. And because the final result is ultimately the death of an individual, it should never be supported. It's on the whole rejected by countries, member states of the UN. 120 member states of the UN voted against the death penalty last week. I mean, this form of punishment is really on the way out.
Ian Woods in Northern Ireland in Portrush. A lot of the justification for the UK to ban the death penalty is mistakes have been made in the past and it's too final. Is that something that you think should be universal?
Well, there certainly have been miscarriages of justice, and I, in the past, have always dealt with the rights and wrongs of the death penalty as a theoretical issue all the way back to my school debating days. But I only became passionately opposed to it when I dealt with firsthand someone who was facing execution. I got to know a man called Richard Glossop, who was sentenced to death in Oklahoma more than 20 years ago, and today is still on death row awaiting his execution. In 2015, he had 3 different execution dates. 2 of those were delayed because of legal appeals. The third one, and I was in the prison waiting for him to be executed, was called off at the last moment because they discovered that they had the wrong lethal injection drug to kill him with. And that was the only thing that saved his life. Since then, there have been no more executions in Oklahoma because of this. So that was where my background comes from in being so passionate against it. I don't think it is a deterrent. And it always struck me as particularly obscene and unusual that the United States, which has very little in common with Iran, with North Korea and China, should be on the same side when it comes to the death penalty.
Well, let's bring in Stephanie McLennan here. Stephanie, it is an interesting one because the US has just announced new measures, including, quite extraordinary, this firing squad, which sounds like a throwback to, revolutions in the post-Russian world. But why are the US doing this? And as one of the bigger countries, is it a bad example?
Look, absolutely. The US is setting a bad example by considering this new form of brutal punishment. We look to the US as one of the leaders when it comes to human rights, and at the moment it's really difficult to view them in that light. Look, I don't believe any form of execution is bearable, whether it's whether it's public hanging, whether it's a gunshot to the back of the head, whether it's a lethal injection. I mean, in the end, they're all barbaric. And look, it's really deeply, deeply concerning and troubling that the US is considering such a barbaric punishment.
In Tehran, Hamid Mousavi, you've heard the arguments there from both our guests in Melbourne and in Portrush, Northern Ireland. I mean, are you still sure that this is useful and a deterrent for a country like Iran?
Well, I don't think anyone supports punishing someone that is innocent, and there should be checks and balances in place to ensure that innocent people are not prosecuted. But I mean, the same rationality can be used for any type of punishment. I mean, even life imprisonment, mistakes can be made. Nevertheless, I think the main issue at hand here is that when we're talking about global norms and global values, we have to, first of all, discuss how are these values decided in the first place. Did Eastern countries or Asian countries or Muslim countries, were they actually participant to these kinds of discussions where the definition of what is human rights and what is barbaric were decided? I think there are a lot of power relations here at play, where Western countries are getting to impose their own values on countries such as Iran. So I think every country should get the option to have their own system based on their own culture and what their own people want.
But actually, I mean, that's a bit disingenuous, isn't it? Because there was a vote in the UN just a few days ago, and Iran voted to keep the death penalty. You do have a say in whether the death penalty as a country should be in your country or not. You have a say.
Well, and like you said, Iran voted against. What I meant was not a vote of the international system in the United Nations, but actually how many people in each country support a system. If a majority of Iranians don't support the death penalty, then that would be a different story. But every poll in Iran shows that a very large majority of Iranians do support the death penalty, and I don't see how foreign countries get to impose their will on the will of the Iranian people. So I don't see how that can work.
It can't be an imposition if you have a vote in it, though.
But again, Iran voted against it. So if there's a vote in the United Nations, say like, let's assume that 100 countries in the world vote against having the option of wearing the hijab. Would that mean that Iran should abolish that just because other countries voted against the system? What I mean is each country separately within their own system, the will of the people should be implemented. And listen, even in the United States, the latest YouGov poll shows that almost 2/3 of Americans support the death penalty. So if Americans want the death penalty, I think the government should implement it. It's a democracy.
Ian Woods in Portrush, Northern Ireland. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm shaking my head during the course of that because I don't think that opinion poll is right. I think that the Gallup poll, which is considered the gold standard, if you like, for how Americans view the death penalty, over the past 25 years, the figures in favour of the death penalty have fallen from more than 80% to just over 50%. It is still a majority-held view in the United States that the death penalty is worthwhile keeping on the statute book. But when you also ask questions such as, would you replace it with life in prison without parole, then that brings the percentage down even further, and a majority are against the death penalty. Now, we can argue as to whether the popularity of something is a reason for legislating on that. I would hope that moral standards carry some weight here. And certainly when I was writing my book back in 2016, it seemed as if the United States was moving towards the abolition of the death penalty. If Hillary Clinton, I believe, had been elected president, then the balance of the Supreme Court in the United States would probably have tilted in the Liberals' favour. And of course, we've seen under Donald Trump how it now has a 6-3 Conservative majority. If it had gone that way under Hillary Clinton, I'm pretty sure that the death penalty, if not off the statute book and abolished already, that would certainly be something that was likely to happen in the next few years, because states, individual states, are all moving in that direction. Very few actually carry out the death penalty now, not just because they know that it is controversial, but they know that it is ineffective. It hasn't proved to be a deterrent. And most of the law enforcement bodies recognise that as well now. Most crimes are carried out out of moments of passion rather than necessarily planned. And therefore, the deterrent factor doesn't really come into it there. I mean, I think that most people, when they analyse the reasons for the death penalty, it comes down to feeling that it is the necessity for revenge or retribution on behalf of victims. But victims are not helped when people are executed wrongly. And 170 people have been exonerated, having been sentenced to death in the United States. Their cases were found to be that they were completely innocent. Now, if the law hadn't intervened at the last moment, they would be dead and there wouldn't be any opportunity to argue that case anymore. Now, they will say in some legal quarters that, well, that shows that the system works because those people were eventually exonerated. But how many of the more than 1,500 people who've been executed in the United States since 1976 were innocent? Most people think that a good, healthy percentage of more than 10% of those were likely innocent people.
Let's bring in Stephanie McLennan here in Melbourne. Stephanie, so we're in a situation right now where some of the bigger countries and the regional powers, Iran, for example, the US, China, have the death penalty, which allows smaller countries to say, well, those bigger countries have the death penalty, so, don't take a look at us, take a look at them. Is there any pressure you can put on the big countries, the regional powers, to get rid of the death penalty, or are you simply shouting into the void?
Yeah, look, 120 countries voted against the death penalty last Monday. And we are fairly confident that the UN will adopt that vote at the General Assembly plenary in December. Look, 39 countries did vote against it. They wanted to keep the death penalty. But we know that those countries, a lot of those countries, are some of the most serious human rights violators in the world. China, Iran, Vietnam, North Korea. I mean, these are countries with egregious human rights records. And of course, any country that votes in favour of it is sending a terrible signal. That votes against the resolution is sending a terrible signal to other countries that it's okay. And look, we as an organisation are really calling on the strong countries that have voted in favour of a moratorium, in favour of a halt on executions, to apply pressure, whether that's through trade or whether it's through negotiations at the UN, but to really raise their voice and call it out for what it is, which is a very barbaric and inherently cruel practice.
In Tehran, Hamid Mousavi, isn't this the real cost to Iran about the death penalty? Already you've been criticised for your human rights record. This is yet one more example, a very powerful example, that you can be criticised for, and yet you still say, well, it's popular in the country, so therefore we should keep it. But it's yet another way of beating up Iran in the public sphere.
I mean, it's a very politicized matter. The reason Iran is being criticized, I would say, I'm not saying every criticism. Of course, there are genuine criticisms as well, and maybe valid criticisms as well. But the criticisms that you hear on US media, a lot of it is politicized. And one measure of that is that a lot of the same issues were going on in Iran during the time of the Shah, and Iran was actually supported, and there were very few denunciations of Iran. Listen, here's the thing. When we're talking about voting in the UN, it's really not their decision to decide. I mean, if say 100 countries vote for California to become a separate country, does that give them the right to vote on that? So I don't think there is a legitimate basis to impose the values of other countries on countries such as Iran. Mind you, in Iran, the execution numbers have decreased significantly, coming to almost 250 per year. And this is even though that Iran has almost 2,000 homicides every year. In Iran, the family of the victim is actually given the option to forgive the perpetrator of the murder. And in large numbers, in the majority of cases, that has actually happened. But there is always the option and the deterrent that if you actually kill someone, that there is a chance that you will be executed. And I think that's something positive.
In Portrush, Northern Ireland, Ian Woods, our guest seems to be saying that actually it's a system that works for us. But in the US, where the victim's family don't get a say in whether the death penalty should take place or not, I mean, why is the death penalty still on the books there? You've spent a lot of time covering all of this. Can you tell us?
Well, it's, I call my book Surviving Execution because it does seem to survive despite all the blows that it has been taking, both from campaigners and even from victims who you would think would be in favour of the death penalty if they have seen their loved ones killed. You can understand the emotion involved in the case, and I absolutely understand that they might want to see that kind of retribution. But equally, there are people who don't want to see that. I met a man whose daughter was killed in the Oklahoma bombing, in which Timothy McVeigh was ultimately executed by the federal government. He didn't want to see that. He didn't think that it brought any comfort to him as a victim, and he actually became friendly with the father of the murderer himself, bringing together the kind of common bond that they had both lost loved ones unjustly. The United States is a slightly different case to many countries because they devolve the powers on the death penalty to individual states. And yes, the federal government occasionally does carry out federal executions, and Donald Trump and Bill Barr, the US Attorney General, are still carrying out executions, even though it's a lame duck administration. Joe Biden is set to take over in January. But even when Joe Biden becomes president, he himself will have no power other than when it comes to federal crimes to deal with death penalty issues. It is down to individual states. But as I say, it's only a matter of a handful of states now, such as Texas and such as Virginia, who are still carrying out these executions, even though there are substantial numbers of people within those states who approve of it and want to carry on executing. I think it sends a terrible example when the United States is trying to lecture other countries on their human rights records, when it has such an appalling record when it comes to the death penalty itself. And executions were at one point being carried out at such a rate that they hardly merited coverage in the newspapers. When I was a Washington correspondent in 2002, 2003, you would quite frequently pick up a newspaper and discover in the inside pages that there had been an execution in Virginia that night. But they were being carried out at such a rate that nobody seemed to care anymore. Thankfully, the numbers have fallen significantly, and fewer than 20 people a year are now executed. But a lot of people would say that that's still far too many.
Stephanie McLennan, one of the bigger problems you've got here when it comes to international agreements is one of enforcement. Yes, you can vote for the moratorium on capital punishment, but if a country breaks that moratorium, even if they voted for it, there's not a huge amount you can do.
Yeah, look, of course, every country is a sovereign entity, and they like what the individual is saying about Iran. Every country can do what they like, but it doesn't mean that you're off the hook internationally. You still operate in a global system, a global economy where you rely on relationships with other countries. And if you continue to behave in a rights disrespecting manner, there will be repercussions. And look, it's not simple. I get it, but to devalue the UN and to devalue the system of human rights, which is about dignity and respect for life, is a really poor and terrible way to go down. Like, it's not appropriate.
Hamid Mousavi in Tehran, you talked a lot about international agreements and how they're not a one-size-fits-all for every country. But Iran, when it comes to nuclear power, when it comes to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which you are a signatory to, when you're being criticised for your nuclear weapons program, alleged nuclear weapons program, or nuclear program generally, you say, well, actually, we signed up to the NPT. Iran, Pakistan, India, North Korea didn't, and they have nuclear weapons, which are illegal. So you're quite happy to trot out an international agreement then, but when it comes to the death penalty, you're much more hands-off and say, well, look, one size doesn't fit all. Isn't that a little hypocritical?
Well, regarding the NPT, it's actually a voluntary agreement. So every country can decide for themselves whether they want to be part of the NPT or not. So it's actually not
but
a
it is an agreement.
one-size-fits-all.
There is agreement Iran hides behind, or trumpets rather than hiding.
Right. So Iran did sign up for the NPT, and based on that, Iran is actually being monitored by the IAEA more than any country in the world. Nevertheless, that's something that Iran decided on itself. It wasn't something that was imposed on Iran. But when we're talking about something that is about the death penalty, we have to take into consideration the cultural and religious distinctiveness of other countries. I mean, just because the West is the more powerful side in the globe right now, they shouldn't be able to impose their own values on other countries. And we have to remember that a lot of the time, these sort of human rights issues are politicized as well. So they're actually sometimes used as a political tool to pressure other countries because of other reasons, not necessarily because of human rights issues.
I want to thank all our guests. Stephanie McLennan, Hamid Mousavi and Ian Woods. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.